My life was a collection of carefully managed routines, each one a small brick in the wall I'd built around myself. Wake at 6. Coffee black. Work at the small desk crammed into the corner of my studio apartment until my eyes burned. A walk in the evening, always the same route through quiet residential streets where the houses were neat and the lives within them felt impossibly distant. It was a life ordered not for happiness, but for the absence of surprise. Surprises, in my experience, were rarely good. They were eviction notices, client contracts falling through, the sharp, sudden silence of a person deciding you were no longer worth their time. The apartment itself was a testament to this philosophy. Everything had its place, not because I was naturally tidy, but because owning so little made organization a necessity. A single well-tended succulent sat on the windowsill, its stubborn green a small defiance against the gray city smog. My laptop, my most valuable possession, was the hub of my existence, the portal through which my graphic design work trickled in, just enough to cover rent and cheap groceries. It was a small, contained world, and most days, I convinced myself it was enough. But there were cracks in the foundation, moments when the quiet felt less like peace and more like a void. It was in those moments that I'd let myself think of him, Julian Vance. His name was a quiet chord in the city's symphony, a name attached to buildings, to charitable foundations, to the kind of quiet, immense wealth that reshaped landscapes without making a sound. I'd first seen him not at some grand gala, but at a local farmer's market a year ago, buying tomatoes with a focused sort of gravity, his presence a pocket of stillness in the weekend crowd. He had looked older than in his rare public photos, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair more silver at the temples. He wasn't handsome in the sharp, polished way of actors or models. His was a face shaped by thought, by a steady, assessing calm that I found myself drawn to in a way that felt both foolish and inevitable. We had made eye contact for a split second, a simple, accidental glance. His eyes, a deep, clear gray, had held mine for a moment longer than necessary before he gave a small, polite nod and turned away. That was it. That was the entire extent of our interaction. And yet, I held on to it. I had a news article bookmarked on my browser, a profile piece from years ago that I'd read more times than I could count. It spoke of his tech empire, built and sold before he was 40, and his subsequent retreat from the public eye to manage his investments and philanthropy. The article called him an enigma. To me, he was just the man with the quiet eyes at the farmer's market. A symbol of a world so far from my own that it felt like another planet, one with a different sun and a gentler gravity. My fascination was a secret, a harmless indulgence I allowed myself in the lonely hours after midnight. The email arrived on a Tuesday. The subject line was simply design inquiry, and the sender was a name I didn't recognize. I nearly deleted it, assuming it was another spam offer for a logo design contest with a $50 prize. But something made me open it. The message was brief, professional, and it mentioned a referral from a small nonprofit I'd done some pro bono work for months ago. They were looking for a designer for a short-term project, a commemorative booklet for a local historical society. It was signed by an assistant, but the name at the bottom of the inquiry, the client's name, made my breath catch in my throat. Julian Vance. I read the email 3 times, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It had to be a mistake. A different Julian Vance. But the nonprofit mentioned was one I knew he was a primary benefactor of. A cold knot of panic and a dizzying spark of something like hope tightened in my stomach. This was a surprise. A big one. My carefully constructed wall was facing a wrecking ball. I spent an hour composing a reply, deleting and rewriting sentences, trying to sound professional and not like a man whose world had just tilted on its axis. I kept it simple, attached my portfolio, and hit send before I could lose my nerve. His assistant replied within the hour to schedule a meeting. The address provided was for a downtown office building, but the suite number was on the penthouse floor. Of course it was. The day of the meeting, I changed my shirt 4 times, finally settling on the least worn of my button-downs. Each choice felt monumental, a desperate attempt to broadcast a competence I did not feel. My reflection in the elevator's polished brass was a stranger, a young man with wide, nervous eyes, trying to look like he belonged in a place where the air itself seemed to cost money. The assistant, a kind woman with a warm smile, led me into a corner office. And there he was. He stood to greet me, and the first thing that struck me was his stillness. Julian Vance didn't move with the hurried energy of most people. His movements were deliberate, economical, as if he'd considered each one and found it necessary. He was taller than I'd thought, dressed in a simple dark sweater and gray trousers that looked more comfortable than a suit, but were probably more expensive than my entire wardrobe. "Leo," he said, and his voice was exactly as I'd imagined it might be. Low and calm, with a warm, gravelly texture. It wasn't a voice that demanded attention. It simply commanded it by its presence. He extended a hand. "Thank you for coming." "I'm Julian." His handshake was firm, his palm warm and dry. My own hand felt cold and slightly damp. I tried to pull away after a professional beat, but his grip lingered for a fraction of a second, his thumb pressing lightly against my knuckles. It was nothing, a microgesture, but it sent a jolt straight through me. I saw him register my reaction in the slight flicker of his gaze, but his expression remained placid, a calm lake I couldn't see the bottom of. He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs opposite his large, uncluttered desk. The desk itself was a piece of art, a single slab of dark, polished wood that seemed to float in the enormous room. Behind him, a floor-to-ceiling window offered a panoramic view of the city, a view I could have spent an hour just staring at. It was my city, the one I walked through every day, but from up here it looked different. Tidy. Manageable. A map of a place I didn't quite live in. "Your work for the Greenway project was excellent," he began, his eyes on me, steady and assessing. It wasn't an empty compliment. It was a statement of fact. "You have a clean aesthetic. A good sense of space." I could only manage a nod, my throat suddenly dry. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Julian, please." The correction was gentle, but it felt like a recalibration of the room's dynamics. It was an invitation to step a little closer, and the thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He explained the project. The Historical Society was celebrating its centennial, and he was funding a small, beautifully printed booklet to commemorate it. He spoke about old photographs, archival letters, the importance of preserving the small stories that make up a city's soul. He wasn't just a benefactor writing a check. He was genuinely passionate about it. As he spoke, I watched his hands. They were capable hands, with long fingers and clean, trimmed nails. They rested on the desk, one loosely curled, the other tracing the edge of a leather-bound book. I imagined those hands working with wood or in a garden, hands that knew how to build things. He wanted to hire me for the full design and layout. He named a fee that made my head spin. It was more than I'd made in the last 6 months combined. I must have looked stunned, because his expression softened with something that looked like concern. "Is that acceptable?" he asked, his tone even. "It's more than acceptable," I stammered out. "It's very generous. It's the proper rate for a project of this quality," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I don't believe in underpaying for talent, Leo." The words were simple, but the way he said my name, the directness of his stare, made it feel like more than a business transaction. It felt like he was seeing me. Not just the nervous designer in a worn-out shirt, but the talent he believed was there. This was the catalyst. This was the door swinging open into a world I had only ever observed from the outside. He was offering me a contract, a professional opportunity, framed with impeccable ethics and clear boundaries. And yet, sitting there, caught in the quiet gravity of his presence, I knew it was also something more. It was a chance to be near him. It was a risk to the careful, quiet life I had built. I took a breath, the conditioned air of his office cool in my lungs. I looked from the impossible view behind him back to his steady, patient eyes. And I said yes. The contract was signed, and we agreed that it would be easiest to work together at his home office a few days a week. He explained it was where he kept all the archival materials, and it would save the hassle of transporting delicate documents. The reasoning was perfectly logical, but the thought of being in his personal space sent another wave of nervous energy through me. His penthouse office was one thing. His home was another entirely. It felt impossibly intimate. His house wasn't a mansion in the flashy, ostentatious sense. It was an old stone structure on a tree-lined street, set back from the road behind a low, unassuming wall. It felt solid, permanent. It had the quiet confidence of old money, not the desperate shout of new. When he opened the door for me that first morning, the scent of old wood, lemon polish, and brewing coffee washed over me. It smelled like stability. It smelled like home, or at least a version of home I'd only ever read about in books. The study was magnificent. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked read and cherished, not just displayed. A large oak desk stood near a set of French doors that opened onto a sprawling garden, green and meticulously kept even in the cooling autumn air. He'd set up a workspace for me at a heavy wooden table perpendicular to his own desk. We were in the same room, close enough to speak without raising our voices, but with enough space between us that I didn't feel like I was encroaching. Those first few days, I barely spoke. I focused on the work, scanning photographs, reading handwritten letters from a century ago, losing myself in the task. But I was aware of him in a way that was almost a physical hum beneath my skin. I was aware of the soft scratch of his pen on paper, the quiet click of his keyboard, the low murmur of his voice when he took a phone call. He moved around the room with a silent grace, a man completely at ease in his own skin, in his own space. I started watching him. It was a subtle, constant observation from the corner of my eye. I watched the way he'd push his reading glasses up onto his forehead when he was thinking, pinching the bridge of his nose. I watched the way his brow would furrow in concentration as he read, and the way it would smooth out when he looked up and caught my eye, offering a small, questioning smile as if to ask if I needed anything. He was a creature of quiet habits. He made coffee at 10 o'clock every morning, in an old-fashioned percolator that filled the room with a rich, dark aroma. He would bring me a mug without asking, setting it down carefully on a coaster beside my laptop. The first time he did it, I was so startled I almost knocked it over. The mug was heavy ceramic, warm against my cold hands. The coffee was strong and black, just how I liked it. I wondered if it was a coincidence, or if he had somehow noticed that first day in his office. "Thank you," I'd said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "Of course," he'd replied, already turning back to his desk. The gesture was simple, a small act of hospitality. But to me, it felt like a thread being spun between us, thin and delicate. Each day, another thread, a shared silence that wasn't awkward. The way he'd sometimes read a passage from an old letter aloud, sharing a piece of history he found particularly moving. The quiet foundation of something new was settling between us, and I was terrified I would do something to crack it. My internal analysis went into overdrive. Every small action he took, I dissected for meaning. When he paused before answering a question, was he carefully choosing his words, or was he bored? When he looked at my design mock-ups, his expression unreadable, was he impressed or disappointed? I was constantly bracing for the moment he would realize his mistake, the moment he would see me as the imposter I felt I was, a kid from a rundown apartment playing at being a professional in a billionaire's study. One afternoon, I was struggling with a particular layout, trying to fit a long, cumbersome quote around a faded photograph. I must have sighed in frustration, a small, sharp sound. I didn't realize he'd heard me until his shadow fell over my table. I looked up, startled. He was standing behind me, looking down at my screen. He was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. "A problem?" he asked, his voice low. "Just wrestling with the text flow," I said, my own voice a little shaky. My awareness of his proximity was overwhelming. I could see the fine weave of his sweater, the way a single silver hair curled at his collar. He leaned in closer, pointing a finger at the screen, his knuckle brushing against my shoulder. The contact was brief, feather-light, but it sent a cascade of fire down my arm. My breath hitched. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. "What if you pulled the quote out?" he suggested, his finger tracing a box in the air. "Treat it as a graphical element on its own. Let the photograph breathe." His idea was simple, elegant, and instantly solved the problem. I felt a flush of embarrassment for not having seen it myself, mixed with a dizzying sense of connection. He wasn't just the client. He was collaborating, engaging with the work on a creative level. That's much better," I managed to say. He straightened up, and the space he'd occupied was suddenly cold. "You're doing good work, Leo," he said. The praise was delivered in his usual calm, factual tone, but the weight of his gaze felt different. It was warmer, less assessing, and more appreciative. He held my eyes for a long moment, and I felt that familiar, terrifying pull, the desire to lean into his orbit, to close the small, safe distance I kept between us. He gave a slight nod and returned to his desk. I turned back to my screen, but I couldn't focus. My shoulder still tingled where his hand had brushed it. The air was still thick with his presence. I replayed the moment in my head, the low timbre of his voice beside my ear, the accidental, meaningful touch. It was ambiguous. It could have been nothing. A simple, professional interaction. But my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm that told me it was something. It was everything. The small touches began to accumulate, each one a stone dropped into the quiet pool of my life, the ripples spreading wider each time. There was the time he passed me a heavy archival book, and our fingers brushed. He didn't pull away immediately. His skin was warm, his touch gentle, and for a heartbeat, his fingers rested against mine before he let go. I spent the rest of the afternoon acutely aware of my own hands, the memory of his touch a faint, electric hum. Another day, we were standing side by side at the large table, looking over a series of proofs. I leaned in to point out a detail, and my shoulder brushed against his arm. It was my fault, my movement, but he didn't shift away. He held his ground, allowing the contact to remain, a solid, warm line of pressure from his shoulder to mine. We stood like that for nearly a minute, discussing typography in low voices, the casual physical contact, a silent conversation happening beneath the surface. Neither of us acknowledged it. Neither of us apologized or explained. It just was. And that, somehow, made it more significant. I started to think about the difference between us less as a barrier and more as a landscape we were both navigating. The vast expanse of his wealth and experience was like a mountain range, while my own life was a small, quiet valley. But from time to time, he would come down from the mountain to meet me where I was. He never did it with condescension. It was always with a quiet, observant respect. He started asking me about my life, small, careful questions. He asked about the kind of design work I enjoyed most, about the city I grew up in. He listened, truly listened, to my answers, his gray eyes focused and attentive. He remembered details I mentioned in passing, bringing them up again days later. It was unnerving and deeply flattering. No one had ever paid that kind of attention to me before. He made me feel interesting. He made me feel seen. The project required a display stand for the Centennial Gala, a simple but large structure to hold a poster-sized print of the booklet's cover. It was delivered flat-packed to his house, a monstrosity of wood panels and confusingly labeled hardware. The delivery men left it in the grand entryway, and Julian and I stood over it like it was an unexploded bomb. "Well," he said, a rare hint of amusement in his voice. "It appears some assembly is required." I found myself smiling, a real, unforced smile. "I think I can handle a few screws. Let's tackle it together," he said. "I'll make more coffee for the next 2 hours." We worked on the floor of his foyer, surrounded by instruction sheets that seemed to be written in another language. The formal roles of client and contractor dissolved completely. We were just two men, one of whom was significantly more competent with an Allen key than the other. That one was me. Julian, for all his intellectual and financial prowess, was surprisingly clumsy with the small, fiddly bits of hardware. He dropped a screw, and it rolled under a heavy antique console table. We both got down on our hands and knees to look for it. We were suddenly at eye level, the space between us charged and close. The smell of dust and old wood mingled with his clean, personal scent. His hair was slightly mussed, and there was a smudge of dust on his cheek. He looked human, approachable. "I think I see it," I said, my voice a little breathless. I reached under the table, my arm brushing against his. He didn't move. I fumbled for the screw, my fingers closing around the cool metal. As I pulled my arm back, I looked at him. His gaze wasn't on the screw. It was on me. The amusement was gone, replaced by an expression of unguarded intensity that made my stomach swoop. It felt like a moment suspended in time. The world narrowed to the few inches of space between our faces, to the sound of our breathing in the quiet hall. I could see the flecks of silver and blue in his gray eyes. I could see the faint lines etched at their corners. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted it so badly it was a physical ache in my chest. Then he blinked, and the moment was broken. He pushed himself back to a sitting position, a faint flush on his high cheekbones. "Good," he said, his voice a little rough. We were in danger of being defeated by Swedish engineering. The light-hearted comment was a life raft, and I grabbed it. I laughed, a shaky, relieved sound. I wasn't about to let that happen, We finished assembling the stand in a more careful, deliberate silence. But the dynamic had shifted. Something had been acknowledged in that moment on the floor, an unspoken truth that now hung in the air between us. We were no longer just working together. We were circling something deeper, something far more complicated and far more fragile. Later that week, as we were finalizing the last pages of the booklet, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me, his expression serious. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. I felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my gut. This was it. He was going to say the project was done, thank me for my time, and I would walk out of his house and his life forever. Leo, he began, his voice soft. I hope this arrangement has been comfortable for you. I was so relieved he wasn't firing me that I just nodded dumbly. He continued, choosing his words with care. I'm aware that my circumstances can be intimidating. I wouldn't want you to ever feel that you are obligated to be here, or that my offering you this project was anything other than a genuine appreciation for your work. It was a moment of profound vulnerability. He was the billionaire, the one with all the power, and yet he was the one expressing concern about how that power was perceived. He was worried about me. He was worried that he might be seen as controlling, as coercive. He was handing me back my agency, making it clear that the door was open, and I was free to walk through it at any time, with no repercussions. It was the most considerate thing anyone had ever done for me. My throat felt thick. Julian, I said, and my own voice sounded stronger, clearer than it had before. It's been the best professional experience of my life. You've been nothing but respectful, good, he said, but he didn't look entirely convinced. He held my gaze. And personally? The question hung in the air. An open door, just as he'd said. Not a test, but an invitation to be honest. My heart was hammering, a frantic, wild thing in my chest. This is it, the moment of truth. My fear of rejection was a cold, heavy weight, but the quiet, steady warmth in his eyes gave me courage. I took a breath. Personally, I started, my voice trembling slightly. It's been more than that. A slow, deep exhale was his only response. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease. He had opened a long-locked door within himself, just a crack, to show me he was just as uncertain as I was. And in doing so, he'd given me the key to my own. The tipping point came a few days later. The booklet was finished, sent to the printers. To celebrate, Julian suggested we go out for lunch. Not as a client and contractor, he'd specified, but as two people who had accomplished something together. I agreed, my stomach a flutter of nerves and excitement. He chose a quiet, elegant bistro downtown, the kind of place where the waiters wore starched aprons and the water glasses were never empty. We were seated at a corner table, and for the first time, we were together in a public space that wasn't a farmer's market or his cloistered office. It felt different, exposed. I was acutely aware of the other patrons, of their subtle, curious glances. We were an odd pairing, the distinguished, silver-haired man in a tailored blazer and the younger man in a simple sweater who looked like he was still paying off student loans. I could feel their eyes on us, could almost hear the gears of their judgment turning. We were in the middle of a pleasant conversation about old films when a man stopped by our table. He was loud, dressed in an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide his fleshy softness. He greeted Julian with an overly familiar slap on the back. "Julian, good to see you out and about," he boomed, his eyes flicking over to me with a dismissive, appraising look. "And who's this?" "Your new intern." The words hung in the air, thick with insinuation. My face burned with humiliation. I felt myself shrink in my chair, wanting to disappear. I was nothing more than an accessory, a curiosity, a new intern. It confirmed every single one of my deepest insecurities. Julian's demeanor didn't change, but a cold stillness settled over him. His friendly warmth vanished, replaced by a polite, impenetrable ice. He didn't even look at the man. His eyes were on me. "Robert," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is Leo. He's my partner." My head snapped up. I stared at him, my heart stopped dead in my chest. Partner. He'd said partner. The word was a shield, a declaration. It was ambiguous enough to mean business partner, but the way he said it, the protective steel in his tone, the way his gaze was fixed on me, checking to see if I was all right, it meant more. So much more. The other man, Robert, was taken aback. He stammered a clumsy apology and beat a hasty retreat. Julian watched him go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his full attention back to me. The noise of the restaurant faded away. It was just the two of us, enclosed in a bubble of charged silence. "I apologize for that," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Robert is an ass." I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, my mind reeling. He had defended me. He had claimed me, in a way, in front of one of his peers. He had drawn a line in the sand and placed me firmly on his side of it. It was the most profound act of protection I had ever experienced. The waiter arrived to take our order, and the interruption gave me a moment to gather myself. We ordered, and when the waiter left, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with everything that had just happened, with the weight of the word he had used. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine where it rested near my water glass. His touch was warm and firm, a steady anchor in my sea of confusion and shock. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. "Leo," he said, his voice soft, compelling me to meet his eyes. I meant what I said, not in the way Robert would understand it, perhaps, but in the way that matters. We are partners in this project, and I would like it if we could be partners in more. There it was. The direct question, wrapped in the gentlest of terms. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a presumption. It was an offer. An invitation into a future I had only dared to dream about in the quietest hours of the night. He was asking what I wanted, giving me the final say, ensuring the power in the dynamic was balanced between us. "What do you want, Leo?" he asked again, his gaze searching mine, filled with a quiet, hopeful yearning that mirrored my own. The check arrived after our meal. We had navigated the rest of lunch in a state of suspended animation, the conversation stilted but underpinned by a new, thrilling current of emotion. His hand had retreated to his side of the table, but I could still feel the phantom weight of it on mine. The question he'd asked hung between us, unanswered but understood. When the waiter placed the small leather billfold on the table, my instincts took over. It was a compulsion born of years of scraping by, of always needing to prove I could pull my own weight. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the cool leather. "I've got this," I said, the words feeling flimsy and absurd even as I spoke them. Before my hand could close around it, his moved, covering mine. It was a gentle but unyielding pressure. He didn't just stop my hand. He held it there, his larger hand completely engulfing mine against the billfold. With his other hand, he slid a sleek, heavy black card from his wallet and placed it on top of our joined hands. "We'll take care of it," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for me. His eyes weren't on the check, or the card, or the waiter who was discreetly approaching. His eyes were on me. The word "we" landed with the force of a promise. It wasn't about the money. It was about partnership. It was about a shared future, starting with this one simple act. He wasn't paying for me. He was taking care of us. My breath caught. I looked down at our hands, his strong, warm hand covering mine, his card resting on top, a symbol of his world, but the gesture beneath it a symbol of something far more important. A connection. A choice. He slid his hand away slowly, his fingers trailing over mine, and my hand fell back to the table, limp. I felt a profound, bone-deep sense of surrender. Not of defeat, but of release. I was letting go of the desperate need to prove myself, to fight for my tiny patch of ground. I was letting him take care of this. I was letting him take care of me. He signed the slip, and we left the restaurant, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. We walked in silence for a block, the space between us humming with unspoken energy. He hailed a cab, holding the door open for me. Inside, the roar of the city was muffled. We sat side by side on the worn vinyl seat, not touching, but the awareness of his thigh just an inch from mine was a burning line of heat. The ride to his house was the longest 10 minutes of my life. When the cab pulled up to the curb, he paid the driver and we got out, walking up the stone path to his front door. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. He unlocked the door and held it open for me. I stepped inside, into the familiar quiet and the scent of lemon and old books. He closed the door behind us, the soft click of the lock echoing in the grand entryway. He didn't turn on the lights. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. He turned to face me, his expression serious, his gray eyes searching my face in the dim light. This was the breaking point. The moment where everything would either shatter or solidify into something new and real. My heart was a frantic, wild bird in my chest, beating against my ribs. "Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I had to speak first. I had to answer the question he'd asked at the restaurant. I had to be brave, just this once. I took a breath, gathering all my courage. I feel more for you than a contractor should feel for a client," I confessed, the words clumsy and inadequate but utterly honest. More than a friend, a flicker of profound relief crossed his face, smoothing the tense lines around his mouth. He took a step closer, closing the small, safe distance between us. He reached out, not to touch me, but to gently cup my jaw, his thumb stroking along my cheekbone. His touch was electric, a jolt of pure connection that went straight to my core. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "I have hoped you might." His own confession was just as simple, just as honest. And it was everything I needed to hear. The fear that had been my constant companion for weeks, for years, finally receded, washed away by the tide of his sincerity. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my lips. I didn't move. I couldn't. I met him halfway, tilting my head up as his lips met mine. The kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't fiery or demanding. It was slow and deep and breathtakingly tender. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of coffee and quiet certainty. His lips were soft, moving against mine with an unhurried exploration that felt like a homecoming. I melted into him, my hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palms. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the small space between us. His eyes were closed. One of his hands was still cradling my face. The other had come to rest on my waist, holding me gently but securely. It was a kiss that felt right, unforced, inevitable. It was the consummation not of a physical urge, but of weeks of unspoken feeling, of shared glances and quiet moments of understanding. "Leo," he murmured again, the name a soft prayer against my lips. I opened my eyes and found him watching me, his own eyes dark with emotion. He didn't need to say anything else. I could see it all there, the relief, the desire, the profound, startling tenderness he felt for me. And I knew my own face reflected the very same things back at him. We had finally crossed the invisible line, and on the other side, we had found each other. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed. After the kiss, we had talked for hours, sitting on the sofa in his study as the sun went down, the words finally flowing freely between us. We didn't go any further physically. It was too new, too important. The emotional intimacy was what we both needed, the reassurance that this was real. He had driven me home, and at my door, he had kissed me again, a sweet, lingering kiss that promised more. But waking up alone in my small, sparse apartment, the gray morning light filtering through the single window, a familiar unease began to creep in. The events of the day before felt dreamlike, surreal. Julian Vance, the man from the farmer's market, the quiet billionaire, had kissed me. He had feelings for me. It seemed impossible. My old insecurities came rushing back, a tide of cold doubt. What could a man like him possibly see in me? I looked around my room, the patched-up crack in the ceiling, the stack of overdue library books, the worn-out rug. This was my reality. His was a world of penthouse offices and sprawling stone houses. The contrast was a physical ache. Was I just a novelty to him? A temporary diversion from his well-ordered life? The fear of dependency, of being seen as someone who was using him, was a bitter taste in my mouth. I spent the morning in a state of anxious paralysis, staring at my phone, waiting for a text, a call, anything. I was terrified he would call, and equally terrified he wouldn't. Had he woken up with regrets? Had the reality of our differences crashed down on him as it had on me? Every minute that passed without a word from him felt like a confirmation of my fears. My carefully constructed wall, which had been so gloriously breached, was being hastily rebuilt, brick by painful brick. Just as I was sinking into a spiral of self-recrimination, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read it. "Good morning. I was wondering if I could bring you some coffee." It was so simple, so normal, so utterly disarming. It wasn't a grand declaration or a formal summons. It was an offer to bring me coffee. I typed and deleted 3 different replies before settling on a simple yes. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on my apartment door. I took a deep breath and opened it. He was standing there, holding a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees. He was dressed casually, in jeans and a soft gray hoodie, and he looked out of place and perfectly right, all at the same time. He gave me a small, slightly hesitant smile. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I replied, my voice a little weak. I stepped back to let him in. He had to duck his head slightly to get through the doorway. He looked around my small apartment, his gaze taking in everything. I felt a flush of shame, seeing my life through his eyes. But there was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet curiosity. He set the coffees down on my tiny kitchen counter. He turned to me, and his eyes were full of a gentle understanding, as if he could see right through my anxiety. He must have sensed my retreat, my morning of doubt. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His touch was an immediate reassurance, a steady warmth that seeped into my bones and quieted my racing thoughts. "Are we okay?" he asked, his voice soft. It was a direct question, leaving no room for misunderstanding. He was checking in, making sure I was still with him. I squeezed his hand. "Yes," I said, and this time I believed it. "I was just thinking I know," he said. "I was too." He took a step closer. "Leo, this is new for me as well. And I know there are complexities, differences in our lives. But I want to navigate them with you. If you're willing." He then made an offer that showed just how deeply he understood my fears. "The project is officially complete. I'll have my accountant wire the final payment today," he said, his tone practical, businesslike. "From this point forward, we are no longer client and contractor. We are just Julian and Leo. Anything we do, any time we spend together, is completely separate from that. Your independence is not something I ever want to compromise." He was drawing a clear line, creating a new boundary that protected me, that preserved my agency. He was dismantling the power imbalance piece by piece, not with grand gestures, but with practical, thoughtful actions. He was reassuring me that what he wanted was me, not an employee he was sleeping with, not a dependent he could control. It was the second most considerate thing anyone had ever done for me. "Okay," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "Okay, Julian," he smiled, a real, radiant smile that transformed his serious face. He lifted my hand and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. "Good," he said. "Now, drink your coffee before it gets cold." I believe I was told it had to be strong and black. He remembered. Of course he remembered. The Centennial Gala for the Historical Society was the following Saturday. It was our first real test as whatever we were becoming. It was one thing to exist in the private bubble of his home or my apartment, but it was another thing entirely to step out into his world, together. The invitation had been addressed to him. Plus guest, I was the guest. The word felt both thrilling and diminishing. Julian must have sensed my apprehension. The evening of the gala, he came to my apartment to pick me up. I was standing in front of my small mirror, trying to tame my hair, my stomach in knots. I'd bought a new suit, the most expensive piece of clothing I'd ever owned, but I still felt like a fraud. He knocked, and when I opened the door, he was standing there in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He looked like he'd stepped out of a classic movie. He looked at me, his eyes traveling from my nervous face down to my new shoes and back up again. "You look incredible, Leo," he said, his voice full of a sincere warmth that instantly eased some of my tension. "You don't look so bad yourself." I managed, a small smile tugging at my lips. He stepped inside and held out a small, flat box. I thought this might complete the look. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were a pair of simple, elegant silver cufflinks, shaped like tiny, stylized oak leaves. They were beautiful, understated, and perfect. "Julian, you didn't have to. I wanted to," he said simply. He took one of the cufflinks and gently took my wrist, fastening it onto my shirt cuff. His fingers were deft and warm against my skin. The small, intimate gesture felt more significant than 1,000 expensive gifts. It was an act of adornment, of preparation, of making us a matching set. The gala was held in a grand ballroom downtown, glittering with chandeliers and filled with the city's elite. As we walked in, I felt 100 pairs of eyes turn towards us. I could feel the whispers, the curious stares. I instinctively wanted to put some distance between us, to fade into the background. But Julian moved closer, his hand finding the small of my back. A firm, proprietary pressure that was both a comfort and a clear statement to anyone watching. We are together. We saw Robert, the man from the restaurant, across the room. His eyes widened slightly when he saw us, and he quickly looked away. The message Julian had sent was clear, and it had been received. Throughout the evening, Julian never left my side. He introduced me to his colleagues and friends, not as his intern or his assistant, but simply as Leo. He included me in conversations, valued my opinions, and constantly checked in with me with a small squeeze of my hand or a questioning look. He was my shield and my anchor. He made me feel not like a guest, but like I belonged there, with him. We navigated the public moment together, as a team, as partners. Later, we stood by the display we had built together, looking at the beautiful booklet, now in the hands of hundreds of people. I felt a swell of pride. I had made that. We had made that. A woman I recognized as the head of the Historical Society came over to us, her face beaming. "Julian, the booklet is a triumph," she gushed. Then she turned to me. "And you must be Leo. Your design is just exquisite. You've captured the spirit of the city beautifully." I was so used to being invisible that the direct praise caught me off guard. I stammered my thanks, and Julian's hand tightened on my back, a silent, proud encouragement. In that moment, standing there, being recognized for my work, with Julian solid and warm beside me, I felt a profound sense of peace. The test was over, and we had passed. I wasn't in his shadow. I was standing in the light, right beside him. The day after the gala, we spent the morning in comfortable silence at his house. The tension of the last few weeks had finally dissipated, replaced by a quiet, easy intimacy. I sat in one of the armchairs in his study, reading, while he worked at his desk. But there was no sense of him being the client and me the contractor. We were just two people sharing a space, a quiet Sunday. Around noon, he stood up and stretched. "I'm going to make some lunch," he said. "Stay." It wasn't a command, but a gentle invitation. I followed him into the kitchen, a huge, beautiful room with stainless steel appliances and a massive marble island. It was a chef's dream, but it still felt warm and lived in. I watched as he moved with a familiar competence, pulling vegetables from the refrigerator, washing them in the deep sink. "Can I help?" I asked. He turned and gave me a warm smile. "You can chop the onions, if you don't mind crying." We worked side by side, preparing a simple lunch of pasta and salad. The domesticity of the moment was not lost on me. Here we were, in his kitchen, making a meal together. It felt more real, more intimate, than any fancy dinner at a restaurant could ever be. It felt like arrival. After we ate, we sat on the back terrace, looking out over his beautiful garden. He had a set of keys in his hand, attached to a simple leather fob. He held them out to me. "I want you to have these," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't about you moving in, unless that's something we both decide on much, much later. This is about you having access. A place to come if you need quiet. A place to work if your apartment feels too small. A place to just be. No expectations. No obligations. Just an open door." I looked at the keys resting in his palm. They were more than just metal. They were trust. They were an invitation into his life, offered with respect for my own. He wasn't trying to possess me or rescue me. He was trying to share his world, to make his stability and peace available to me, should I choose to accept it. It was a conscious choice, laid out before me. I took the keys, my fingers closing around them. They were cool and heavy in my hand. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice thick. "You are welcome here, Leo," he said, his gaze unwavering. Always. We sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, not talking, just enjoying the comfortable silence. A quiet intimacy had settled between us, a feeling of rightness, of home. It wasn't a grand, cinematic romance. It was something quieter, deeper, and more real. It was two people from different worlds, choosing to build a new one together, on a foundation of care and mutual respect. In the months that followed, we found our rhythm. I kept my apartment. It was important for me to have my own space, my own ground beneath my feet. But I spent more and more time at his house. Sometimes we would work in companionable silence in his study, me on a new freelance project, him on his own affairs. Other times, we would do nothing at all, just read or listen to music or take walks in the evening. Much like the ones I used to take alone, but infinitely better with his hand in mine. The difference in our ages and our bank accounts didn't disappear. It was a fact of our lives, a piece of the context. But it ceased to be a barrier. His wealth provided opportunities. We traveled, we saw shows, we ate at wonderful restaurants. But he was always careful to make it about the shared experience, not the transaction. He taught me that his resources could be a tool to create joy and comfort, not a weapon to create obligation. And I, in turn, brought something to his well-ordered life that he had been missing. A fresh perspective, a creative spark, a warmth that filled the quiet corners of his big house. One early morning, I woke up in his bed before dawn. I slipped out onto the balcony that overlooked the garden, the cool air a gentle shock to my system. A few moments later, the door slid open and Julian joined me, wrapping a heavy blanket around my shoulders and pulling me back against his chest. He wrapped his arms around me, and I leaned my head back against his shoulder. We stood there in silence, watching the sky slowly lighten from inky black to a soft, bruised purple, then to a brilliant blaze of orange and pink. The city was still asleep, quiet and peaceful. In that moment, held securely in his arms, watching a new day begin, I felt a profound sense of peace settle deep in my soul. I thought back to the man I was a year ago, huddled in his small apartment, building walls to keep the world out, convinced that solitude was the same as safety. I thought of my secret fascination with the quiet man from the farmer's market, a man who represented a world I never thought I could touch. And now, here I was, a part of that world. But more than that, I was a part of his world, and he was a part of mine. The foundation between us, which had started as a few tentative threads, had been woven into something strong and resilient. It was a partnership built not on power or money, but on the quiet, steady acts of mutual care, on honesty, and on the conscious choice, made every day, to love and respect each other. He pressed a soft kiss to the side of my head, his breath warm in the cool morning air. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer yearning for something I couldn't have. I was home. The weight of his gaze, which once felt so assessing and intimidating, now felt like a comforting warmth, a steady light I could always turn to. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of him, of the morning, of our life together, and I felt nothing but a deep and abiding gratitude. I was steady. I was seen. I was loved. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.